Oh, yes. I'm Dr. John McLaughlin, and I'm awaiting the arrival of one Michael T. Simmons.
I heard there's this trail. It's called the Cowlitz Trail.
We've had so much trouble with Mrs. Short around here. She took a claim over on the west side of the fort, and she simply will not leave it.
Well, here we are on the banks of the Columbia River. Well, here we are at the approach to the old living artifact.
It's going to go to Officers Row, which was where the American troops were stationed at the time.
The other existing building, or a building that was here during the trail, is the O.O. Howard House.
Bordering the west side of Esther Short Park is the Slocum House, which was constructed in about 1867. Roger and Karen, come on in. This is the Covington House.
Welcome to the Clark County Historical Museum.
Here's the Covington piano. It's always on display here at the museum.
Leaving Fort Vancouver, the Hudson Bay fur traders and later the immigrants sailed down the Columbia River past this point on their way to the Cowlitz River. Here we are 27 miles north of Fort Vancouver and at the site of present-day Kalama, Washington.
Steamboat Hills School District number 13 was selected for visit by Ezra Meeker.
Been looking across the Columbia River, and there was a site over there that looked attractive. It's where the village of Kalama now stands.
From here we're going to go on north to the Monticello site at what is now called Longview, Washington, to the mouth of the Cowlitz River.
You're looking at an old walnut tree, which some people feel is the site of the original Monticello, which is a very important town that we've talked about a little bit in this video. This walnut tree supposedly was planted by a man named Burbank, who was related to Luther Burbank of plant fame. And it was planted on the land of Harry Darby Huntington, who was the actual founder of the old town of Monticello. The tree is at least 150 years old, probably a little bit older, and it still bears walnuts. It's a black walnut tree, and it has been preserved, and maybe someday we'll figure out if it really is marking the site of the original town. From here, we're going to go and visit the town of Longview and look at the commemorative site of the Monticello Convention and the Monticello Hotel, which was the site where the Monticello Convention was held and where Washington first became a territory. So we'll go over there now.
We're here in downtown Longview, Washington, at the site where the Monticello Convention has been commemorated. And as you can see, the first panel shows a little bit about how Oregon Territory changed into different forms until it became pretty close to what we are now. And this happened in 1853, the Monticello Convention, to actually start statehood or territoryhood for Washington. The next panel tells a little bit about Oregon Territory, and it talks about the Cowlitz Convention, which was in 1851, which predated this one, where the signers of that came together again to this spot, or nearby here, because the actual town of Monticello, though near here, was washed out 2 times by floods and is no longer in existence. The third panel gives the names of many of the people who you will probably have seen or heard on this series of videos. They were all the signers, and all of these people at one time or another traveled the Cowlitz Trail. And you'll even notice some of those are names that are familiar in King County, Seattle area, all the way down to Vancouver. Many of these people were the founders of the different towns that are now in existence. We couldn't possibly have left the site without showing you something that's appeared in Ripley's, believe it or not. The people of Longview in 1963, having compassion for the squirrels that were getting hit on this street, this busy street, built this bridge. And it's called the Nutty Harbors Bridge. And squirrels do use it. We hoped that we could see one, but they're having lunch. And over here, on the other side of me, is the actual monument to the squirrels. Now we're going to be going to the Cowlitz County Museum, which is our next stop, just in Kelso.
Hi, Dave.
Aaron?
Nice to see you again.
Hello, David. Chuck, how are you? Welcome to the Cowlitz County Historical Museum. I'm the director of the Cowlitz County Museum here in Kelso, and I want to welcome you here. The museum's been here in Kelso for over 50 years, and our mission is to preserve and interpret the history of the region. We do that in a number of ways, through exhibits and public programs. We also publish a historical quarterly, and really have fun doing this. We have a core exhibit, which we call Cowlitz Corridor, Footpath to Freeway, which looks at the history of this region over the last 200 years and how the route between the Columbia River and Puget Sound has influenced the way we live our lives. It has impacted us economically and politically and just about every other way that you can imagine. The exhibit starts with the Native Americans. I'd like to point out a few things to you. Obviously, when we talk about transportation routes with the Native Americans, the Cowlitz Indians, we think of canoes. They traveled up and down the Cowlitz rivers and made connections with neighboring tribes throughout the region. This is a dugout canoe, used probably on the slower waterways, slower rivers in the area. Behind it we have a painting done by Henry Ware in 1845 showing Mount St. Helens in the background and some of the Cowlitz Indians on the Columbia River. In the foreground is Mount Coffin, which was a place for Indian burials. Down at this end, we have another painting of a Cowlitz canoe, also done by also done by Henry Ware. This one done in 1845, and showing how a canoe was used as a funeral. This is a copy of a very famous painting by Paul Kane showing a Cowlitz woman, Cowichan. You see that she has a baby in a cradle board with a board using for head flattening. In this area over here, we have some Indian baskets and some of the trade goods that were given to the Indians by the early explorers and traders in exchange for furs and food and other items. Continuing on in the exhibit, we have an area of explorers where we see Robert Gray, Lewis and Clark, and Thomas Jefferson, who sent the Lewis and Clark expedition out to the west. David Douglas, and Lieutenant Charles Wilkes were also in this region too. And then we move into the era of the Hudson's Bay Company, which had a big impact on the Cowlitz region, from Fort Vancouver north up to the farm near what is now Toledo, Washington. This is a painting showing what the Puget Sound Agricultural Company farm was like back in the 1830s. Travelers in later years, the pioneer era, as they traveled up the Cowlitz River, needed a place to stay, and in the 1850s, a house was built called the Jackson Inn. It was a place for travelers to stop and spend the night, and the house is still standing now in 2004, although it's a private residence, of course. It's about 10 miles north of the mouth of the Cowlitz, and was a stagecoach stop after a long day's journey, a welcome spot along the Cowlitz Trail. And then we get into the area of settlement. We have some objects that were brought across the Oregon Trail: dishes, medical supplies, knives, watches, mementos from home. And then we show the early communities: Kelso, Woodland, Castle Rock, Kalama, as they were founded and grew from the pioneer settlements. Over here we have a couple of our more well-known pioneer settlers, Simon Plamondon, who settled up at the Cowlitz Prairie back in 1833. He was also delegate to the Cowlitz and the Monticello Conventions. And Columbia Lancaster, who lived just on the south side of the Lewis River near Woodland, Washington. He was Washington Territory's first congressional delegate. Continue on in the settlement theme. We have a small log cabin that was built up in the Tower District. That's just east of Castle Rock, about 5 miles. Ben Bigley was the owner of this cabin, and he was a timber cruiser up in that area. We've taken some liberties in its reconstruction. It's actually been moved a couple of times, but it gives an idea of the size of a cabin, and it's fun to imagine what it would be like to live in a place like this, and not real comforting on some of those dreary winter days we have here in the Northwest. Over in this area, we have some hands-on items related to the fur trade, some furs, some hand-dipped candles, and bale of wool. Some of these are just trade items that would have been sent up and down the Cowlitz River by the Hudson's Bay Company. Near the mouth of the Cowlitz, the Hudson's Bay Company built a granary so that when the produce from the Puget Sound Agricultural Company's farm there was sent down the river, it could be stored in this granary until a ship could come and take it out up to Sitka, Alaska, to trade with the Russians. Before they built this granary, the ship would have to sit at the mouth of the river for up to 6 weeks at a time while the goods were gradually brought down. It was kind of a waste of the use of the ship. So this granary was built, this storage area, and that became the first non-Native American structure in Cowlitz County and served the purpose of international trade. One of the other areas of the Cowlitz Trail Project that you're involved in is the river, and how that was used by the steamboats beginning in about the 1860s. And we have over here, we have some photographs of steamboats that were used on the river. They're from a later time period, but give us an idea of how they were used and what they did. The real era of steamboats on the Cowlitz River is probably from the 1870s until about 1920. They carried all kinds of cargo. This one here you see has some shingle bolts on the front of them. They are also good for farm products like potatoes and onions and bulky cargoes. And they ran up and down the rivers. One of the last uses of the steamboats was to carry supplies to build bridges and highways, which kind of put them out of business as the trucking industry grew in importance following World War I.
Dave, I understand that you also pulled some special items from your collection. Could we go and see those
Sure.
too?
Come on back into our meeting room. Get the gloves on. Chuck, did you want to say a few words about this map here?
Certainly. This is an 1855 map that was surveyed of Washington Territory, and it shows the Columbia River beginning at Fort Vancouver, flowing northerly, and then turning and going west to the Pacific. At the bend where it turns west is the beginning of the Cowlitz River. It goes up past the site of Monticello, on up past the Jackson Inn that we learned about a few minutes ago, all the way to Cowlitz Landing here at present-day Toledo. And from there, the immigrants and others went overland to Puget Sound on the Cowlitz Trail. Later in the 1860s, the military road started here at Monticello, went up the west bank of the Cowlitz River in a northerly direction to the Chehalis River at Centralia.
Yeah, these maps draw a lot of interest. We have about 4 of them that we got copies of from the National Archives. Not really an artifact, but part of our reference collection to help us learn about the history of the area. Over here, I do have a few artifacts from our collection, some glass beads that were used to trade with the Indians for different products, as I mentioned earlier. They're really interesting to see the different patterns, the colors that were made. As I understand, most of the glass beads came from Murano, Italy. This is an axe head made by a Hudson's Bay Company blacksmith, In fact, if you look closely here, you can see the initials AR have been stamped in them, and that would be the blacksmith who actually made it. This was made by taking a piece of metal and bending it around and then welding it and grinding it sharp. And a real valuable tool in the Hudson's Bay Company era. Over here we have a couple of bottles. These were Hudson's Bay Company bottles. I'm not sure exactly what products came in them, perhaps beer or some other kind of spirits, but they are items of our collection. We talked about the Jackson Inn a few minutes ago. These are a couple of things from the Jackson Inn. This is a crock that was used for food storage, and this is kind of an interesting item. It's a conch shell, and the stories we have about this is that it was used at the Jackson Inn at dinner time. When dinner was ready, to summon the guests, and somebody would take and blow this, and it would sound, I understand, sound somewhat like a trumpet. So it's kind of an unusual thing from the 19th century here in Cowlitz County, and one of the more interesting things we have from that time period. Here we have a document, an original document signed by Peter Crawford. Peter Crawford was a surveyor and was the founder of Kelso. Peter came from Kelso, Scotland, and came out here in 1847. According to the stories we're told, John McLaughlin suggested that he look at the Cowlitz River as a place to settle, and he came here and thought it looked a little bit like the River Tweed, where he had grown up in Scotland. So that's the name of where the name of the city came from. That's our high school team, the Kelso Highlanders, have followed up in that Scottish theme. And this is also a very interesting item related to the history of not only of Cowlitz County, but to the territory of Washington and to later state history. This is a lap desk which belonged to Columbia Lancaster, the first territorial delegate from Washington Territory. Columbia Lancaster lived just across the Lewis River in Woodland. His house is still standing there today, and this desk, as we tell students when they come through on tours, this is the original laptop. He carried his papers in it, and he could sit and work away at it. It does have a little secret compartment in here too. We pull out these slats of wood, and underneath there's a place you can store money or perhaps particularly important papers. But it reminds us of how important the Cowlitz corridor was, the fact that the first territorial delegate lived at the south end of it.
Dave, you've also got some really nice enlargements of historic photos on the walls, and we were noticing that these boats in the photos down here, are those bateaus?
I think they'd be considered bateaus. I'm certainly not an expert on boats, but a double-ended plank boat like that, this one's used on the Lewis River in about 1900, 1920, that time period. I think would be very similar to the ones that were used by the Hudson's Bay Company and later. I think they would certainly recognize it and know how to use it.
Great. Almost every pioneer account we've read about travel up the Cowlitz talked about the people traveling in bateaus, and so this is neat to be able to finally visualize one because we've been shy of pictures on those. Well, thanks so much for showing us around. I wish we had time to see more, but we'll come back sometime.
Well, do come back. You're always welcome.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to do something a little bit different right now and actually take a trip on the river, just like the pioneers would have done 150 years ago. We were lucky enough to meet up with some really nice guys from the Friends of the Cowlitz organization. They're dedicated to preserving fish runs on the river, and their names are Lee York and Mel Canfield. Lee has volunteered to take us on a ride up the river in his speedboat, so we're going to be traveling a little bit faster than they did in the bateaus and canoes and steamboats of the old days. Well, we're here at the mouth of the Cowlitz River where it empties into the Columbia, and you have to imagine what this looked like 150 years ago or more, because it sure has changed. All the industry that's here, you can see the big highway bridge in the background there, and if you look over here to the left, you can see the town of Rainier, Oregon, which was an historic town, a shipping point and the point for travelers to cross the Columbia over into what became Washington Territory. are at the old town site of Monticello. At least it's a guess because the river has changed course, so this is as close as we can get. Monticello started out as a pioneer town about 1850 or so. The pilings and metal remnants that you see here are not original. They were long after the fact. The original town of Monticello flooded out in the winter of 1867 when there was a huge flood and the river changed course. The town was later rebuilt a little bit downstream. I have a photo here of the second town site of Monticello, photo taken about 1875, and it's a poor photo, but it's all we have. And let's look at a map real quickly too, showing the two town sites as they existed. Here we are looking at an alleged site of the town of Freeport. And Freeport was a town started by Seth Catlin, who lived in Monticello, just downriver. Monticello charged for their wharfage, so when a boat tied up at the docks at Monticello, they paid for their docking. Seth Catlin decided he'd start another town upriver a little bit and not charge any boats and hoping to attract more boat business. Now, we're not really sure where Freeport itself was. It could have been at this location we're looking at now. It could be at another spot just a touch up the river. Here we are looking at the old town site of Ostrander. This was a town that was started on the donation land claim of Dr. Nathaniel Ostrander, who came west in 1852. He spent the winter with his family in Portland and then moved up the Cowlitz River to this site where he took out a land claim. The town that grew up eventually on his land claim was named for him. He then moved on to Tumwater, where he spent the rest of his life. Some of these sites we have a little bit of difficulty in pinpointing because you have to remember that the river has changed course over time. Sometimes it's washed away banks or eroded a completely new channel. But here we have the old pilings from the docks that pretty well pinpoint this as being the town of Ostrander. Castle Rock that we're looking at now was a large rock formation, and it's now covered with trees. But back in the old days, it was a bare rock outcropping and must have served as a major landmark for the travelers on the river. Edwin Huntington, who was a pioneer of the 1850s, mentioned that in the early days of the Cowlitz Trail, the river was over 200 feet from the base of the rock. But since then, the river has changed course, and so, as we see here, the river runs right up to the base of the rock called Castle Rock. This shows the difficulty in locating some of the old sites since the river has changed course so many times. Here we are where the Toutle River comes in from the east and feeds into the Cowlitz River. This was a well-known spot in the old days because it was the site of an inn and a ferry kept by James Gardner, who was nicknamed Hardbread. Ezra Meeker, the old-time pioneer, described this place as being Hardbread's is an odd name for a hotel, but the name grew out of the fact that Gardner fed his customers on hardtack 3 times a day, if perchance anyone was unfortunate enough to be compelled to take 3 meals at his place. Here we are at the mouth of Olaqua Creek, which comes in from the west side of the Cowlitz River and feeds in. We're going to see quite a bit of footage of this spot later on when we visit with a descendant of a really early pioneer. But just briefly, this spot was made rather famous by a man named William Pumphrey, and we've got a photo of him. He started a stage stop and a little hotel for travelers, and he was well known in the area. Here we are at the town site of Cowlitz Landing, which along with Monticello was the most important town site on the river. Monticello, of course, was at the mouth of the Cowlitz, and Cowlitz Landing was at the head of the navigation. And we'll find out later why this town site really isn't here anymore. It's been washed away. We also have a map showing the old town site, and this is a map from 1855-56 from the Government Land Office. And if you look on the far right side of the map, you'll see the words F.A. Clark. That stood for Fred Clark, who had a donation land claim, and the town of Cowlitz Landing was actually on his land. And you can see also a ferry crossing here, so that does mark the old town of Cowlitz Landing. Now we're coming up to the town of Toledo, and whoops, people are still catching salmon out here today. But now let's pan around and look at this street that comes down here, and this would have been the site of the old steamboat landings. And we can see Marie Oberg waving to us from the bank, and we're going to go and visit with her later.
I'm Bud May. I'm kind of the unofficial historian of Castle Rock. The official ones died long ago. I'd like to give you a tour of our museum here, and it's also a tour of the past. Castle Rock was founded in 1852 by Mr. William Huntington, who was one of 4 brothers who came west. One of his cousins also was the founder of what is now Longview. It was called Monticello then. That was Darby Huntington. This was a rock that was almost devoid of any vegetation at the time. It happened to be on a land claim that William Huntington filed, 360 acres. You sure couldn't farm it, it wasn't good for much. But when he decided to donate a lot of property for a town, they had to have a name for it so they could have a post office. The boats going up and down the Cowlitz River, which most were stern wheelers, the crews would look at that, and from an angle, it looked like a castle, so they called it the small case Castle Rock. So Mr. Huntington, for whatever reason, thought that was a good name for the town, and so in 1854, when he opened a post office in his home, it became Castle Rock. By the way, you'll see that now, it's in the same spot. It's the only part of it that is rock is from here over. The rest of it has trees on it, some of them 60 or 70 feet high. There's a city park on the top. As in every town along the Cowlitz and Columbia Rivers, Native Americans were here long before we were, and the Cowlitz Indians were the tribe that were active in this area for many years. They were very helpful to the settlers and the people that came in. In fact, without the Indians' help, I doubt that much would have got done for a long time. They even helped after the Civil War. They were trying to map this area, and there was a Lieutenant Wilkinson, and the Indians helped them get up the Cowlitz River to what is now the Blue Olympia. They were very helpful in many, many ways. As you can see, they had primitive tools. These happen to belong to a gentleman that has a lot of Indian artifacts, and this is only a few of them. Here we have here this large picture that shows 2 of these several stern wheelers that traveled up and down the Cowlitz River. In the foreground at the left, you see the Chester, which is one of the smaller stern wheelers, and it carried some cargo and some passengers. There's a lot of general traffic. Behind it is a much larger one that was called the Northwest. That one that could travel the Columbia River, the Cowlitz River, and these boats, most of them went all the way up from Castle Rock to what is now Toledo. The Cowlitz River was much deeper, much wider, and a much bigger stream then. The original lifeblood of this area was agriculture. Most of those people came here and were farmers. All they wanted to do was make a living off the land, and they had farms and crops. But sooner or later, it was bound to happen. A man formed the first of 4 cedar mills here, this being cedar. And at one time, they had 4 going full-time in Castle Rock, and Castle Rock was one of the largest cedar-producing towns along the west coast. And while you're at it, what we have right here is logging equipment. That's a springboard that loggers would stand on in order to cut the tree off several feet above the ground so they wouldn't have the roots and the obnoxious things at the bottom. Now they have power saw, and they would cut them much lower. That's an old, very much used springboard. As I said, these are the cedar mills, and the largest one was the John Robin Mill, and that's the one you see in that photograph over there behind the stern wheelers. He had a rather large crew. And when this picture was taken, there were 700 cords of cedar. And if you got caught with 2 cedar bolts in your car or truck now, they would ask to see your specialized forest harvesting products permit. If you didn't have it, you'd get a ticket. But cedar was just more than, they thought it would never run out. And at that time, the Douglas fir, which would later become the most important industry here for logging, that wasn't even considered that except to clear off land so they could build their farms. But ultimately, this became a big logging capital. And most of the people here, by the way, as I said, Castle Rock being founded in 1852, later when Mr. Huntington also donated the land for the railroad, and when the railroad came through here, Castle Rock grew. I think all towns did when the railroad come through them. But still, the lifeblood was cedar. They'd make shakes, shingles, roofs. They shipped a lot of it out. They used a lot of it for local construction. And after Castle Rock was formed, other pioneers that got here had heard of an area up the Toutle River, which is confluence of Toutle and the Cowlitz is 2 miles north of here. And Silver Lake is 5 miles from here, and then Toutle. And some of the more venturesome people didn't stop here. They went on up there and built houses and built a school, and that's where Toutle came into being. You'd be walking by a lot of Mount St. Helens things here because after the mountain erupted in 1980, this became one of our 3 galleries in Mount St. Helens. We also have some of the world's finest logging carvings over here. The local man who's still alive did. We had 7 world champion loggers here. We have some of their things here and more of them on the other side in the display case. Here's some old logging, back before they had any kind of heavy equipment. They used oxen, horses, mules. There's a 17-foot butt of a cedar tree with a man on it. It looks like he could break his neck if he fell off. Old steam donkey yarders. So we try to preserve the history not only of the town, but of its economy. And when logging started dying out, I know this is after the time you want to talk about, but Castle Rock ultimately became a bedroom community where most of the people live here or work somewhere else, as in Longview and Kelso. Longview has most of the industries, Longview Fiber, Weyerhaeuser, and several others, but there's very little industry thing here now. Most of them work here, live here and work elsewhere. Over here we created a town gallery after we get past these Mount St. Helens things I think you might find interesting. Oh, by the way, these are recreations of pioneer homes. The first family here was the Huntingtons, but also the William Whittle family. In 1860, Henry Jackson came, and he's the one who established the Jackson Inn, which is still in very good condition, but it's a private residence now, where travelers could stay overnight, have meals. These are just replicas of early day businesses over there. Now, getting back to some of our founders that were so important in establishing this town, William Huntington's wife, Eliza, was the first female school superintendent of Cowlitz County. She was instrumental in the founding of the Presbyterian Church here, very active locally. William's brother, Edwin Huntington, married one of the Mercer girls. I'm sure you've all heard of the Mercer girls were brought out here. Asa Mercer brought them from back east. They were all educated, and their purpose was to come out here and bring some civilization and some education and things. And she certainly did. She lived here, and she had so many firsts and most in the county. She was very, very well known. These people were exceptional. And the rest of this, going back to the history of the railroad, the railroad used to be located just across the street here, right downtown. They didn't move it until the early 1900s. That's probably an 1885 crew picture. This is after time too, but there have been several 500-year floods here just in the last 100 years. That was 1906, 1933. As recently as 1996, we had the flood that you see on the blue picture over there. That's a state highway, but what it is now is water in that picture. It's near our fairgrounds. But even Mount St. Helens came right through the middle of town. Destroyed our water intake system, but nobody here was killed, and very little impact on the economy other than the fact that a lot of loggers couldn't go where they were before.
Bud, one of the things that we wanted to ask you is if you had time to take us out to the actual Castle Rock today.
Sure.
Because we have seen it from a boat on the river, and we'd like to see it from land too. And
Absolutely.
we also saw a lot of people fishing down there today.
Yes, yes. This time of year, they're just nailing fish right and left. It's a great fishing run, and a friend of mine got 3 in the last week. I took him to the Seahawk game Sunday, and he's the luckiest guy I've ever seen. And almost everybody got their limit that knew how to fish. Cowlitz has always been salmon, silvers, steelhead, smelt used to run every year, millions. Now it's kind of a hit and rest.
Okay, well, let's go down there.
Okay. Folks, this is the rock for which Castle Rock was named. It was almost 96% barren at the time that William Huntington staked his donation land claim here. Ultimately, all this vegetation you see grew on it, and it was a landmark for stern wheelers going up and down the river. As I told you before, the boat crews referred to it as the Castle Rock, small c, small r, and when Mr. Huntington had to have a name for the post office, that's what he chose, as Castle Rock. Some years ago, probably 80 years ago, a gentleman named Combo built a reservoir on top of that rock, and it supplied Castle Rock with all its water for a lot of years. And ultimately, he sold his system to the city, and the city built a nice treatment plant about 3/4 of a mile up there, and that was disabled by the eruption of Mount St. Helens. As you can see, the Cowlitz River is quite low right now, and it always gets this way in the last 15, 20 years. In those days, that island didn't exist. The water was much deeper. The channel has actually changed 2 or 3 times since then because of floods, the 1933 flood, 1948 flood. But this is a haven for fishermen, and right across the river from us here, I think you see a pickup park now, but it's not uncommon to see 30 or 40, sometimes even 50 trucks and trailers over there when the silver salmon, the Chinook, and steelhead are in. It's a very good fishing area, and they'll launch there and they generally go upstream, some of them downstream, and it's really been a haven for fishermen for a long time. And that's always been one of the attractions. People that come to visit the Castle Rock, can I go fishing in the Cowlitz or the Toutle? And the Toutle is much well known for steelhead, although you can get other fish there too sometimes. Where we're standing here is a walk that the city just put in with lighting and everything, and they're trying to make this a recreational area so visitors can enjoy walking and seeing everything from the west side of the river. So.
Great. Well, Bud, thanks so much for having us over and explaining the history of the city to us. And we're going to head on up the road to the north now and see some more sights on the trail.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Okay, thanks a lot. You take care now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we met Marie down on the waterfront, and now we're going to walk into her Cowlitz River Antique Store and meet her in person. Let's go inside. Hi, Marie. How are you?
Hello. Hi, Chuck. Hi,
Nice to see
Terri.
you.
Good to see you, Roger. Yeah.
Well, we hear that you're going to tell us a little bit about Toledo history today.
All right.
And show us some pictures, maybe?
Yes, we need to go upstairs to our historical library up there. And at that point, I'll get out the best things that we have and show you around.
Great.
Sounds good. We'll just go out the door and we'll be up that way.
Okay.
Hi, I'm really glad you're out here today to take a look at these good memories we have of early day steamboats on the Cowlitz River. This picture was done in 1872 from right out in the middle of the Columbia River, and it depicts the early overnight station for the traveler who would come from San Francisco on this big Pacific mail boat or be coming downriver from Portland. And here's where they would trade, right here on this dock in front of the Dibley House in Rainier, Oregon. Now, if you were heading up the Cowlitz, you would be contracting here with a ride, or if you were coming to get the mail, which Henry Windsor did on a regular basis with his pack train, picking up the mail and taking it up the Cowlitz River, following it along and till he got clear to Olympia. He had the mail route for a number of years. and was very consistent about it. All during the Civil War, this was a major boating station because we had the Union Army guarding the coast, guarding the gate of the Columbia River, and we had the Confederacy taking gold out of the John Day gold fields, bringing it down on the sternwheelers and taking it out to San Francisco for the war effort. So there was a lot of action on the river in those days. 1852, we saw President Grant out here on his horse, probably an overnight visitor, riding the sternwheeler, going up the Cowlitz to sign land grants in the 1850 era up here on the river. If you arrived coming down the Columbia, or however, and you wish to go to take up your land grant, to take up your settlement up in the Olympia area, you would be contracting with for the Cowlitz River. You would probably contact the Kellogg's, and they had a steamer called the Toledo, and they also had one called the Kellogg. The Toledo became more famous, and here's the address where you could go in the days of the week. On Monday and Thursday at 6 o'clock in the morning, they touched at St. Helens, Columbia City, Kalama, Carroll's Point, Rainier, Cedar Landing, and Monticello. Monticello went on north. Freeport, Cowlitz, and Toledo. From Toledo, if you wish to go back, and it didn't work out, it was Tuesday and Friday, and you would arrive back in Portland on Wednesday and Saturday. But you had an overnight trip, and that's why it was so important that the lady in this house always had a ready breakfast, because most of the time people either slept on the little sternwheeler, or there was bedrooms upstairs in this house in a very large dining room where they could take on an extra breakfast. She had a barn with the cows. It was the only place where you could get fresh milk and cream on your oatmeal for breakfast. Down here is a special notice: immigrants with teams bound for the Cowlitz River country. And that's up here in Toledo, that's clear up through to Fort Steilacoom. And points on Gray's Harbor and the Sound are notified that there is no wagon road from Portland. The only way to go via one of the above steamers to some landing on the Cowlitz River. Speed, comfort, and safety are assured. Years later, after people had settled our area, they started raising a lot of potatoes and grain. And Cowlitz Farms was well known for its potato crop along the Cowlitz River. And the soil was very fertile, and it was very moist here. Or the wheat crops that were raised up on the prairie. This is a picture of the steamer, the Chester, right down in the Cowlitz River, and they would bring the wagons right in with their team and load them right into the sternwheeler and then float down the river. And this went on all summer long. Boats bringing supplies for the logging camps, taking grain back to San Francisco. This picture, you see the two sternwheelers. This is the Chester and the Toledo tied up right here. This building in the background, and there's a building right here also, are the old Kellogg warehouses. And in here they kept all the grain that could be raised up here, the sacks of potatoes, or supplies that had to go to Vader or Riderwood to the logging camps. And then they would take teams of horses and wagons and take them out through the little roads, the trails around here. But most all of the supplies for the early settlers had to come up the Cowlitz. You can see the river right back in here. It was big gravel bars, and in the summertime the water would be very low, and these little flat boats, if there was dew on the grass, they said the boats could run. That's about all I have to tell you about the tie-ups right along the river. Down here today, when you saw me standing along the river, was just behind this boat, and we had a ferry crossing here the early days. Usually they would just go across the river on the gravel here because the water was so shallow. They finally, in the 1880s, they put a a little barge there, so you could come up here with your horse and your wagon, particularly if you were going out towards Mount St. Helens area, and could be ferried across here. Okay, and that's about all I have to tell about that.
Well, Marie, we really want to thank you for explaining a little bit about Toledo history, and especially the steamboats that came up the Cowlitz. And you had recommended that we go out to Don Wallace's place, and so we are. We're going to go there now, and we're going to see the Cowlitz Landing from the North Bank, or the old site of the Cowlitz Landing, and also look at a big old cedar tree that we heard was pretty neat. Right. So we're going to go out there now. So thanks again for having us over.
Yes,
we'll see you later.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye now.
Here we are on the north bank of the Cowlitz River at about the location where Cowlitz Landing was originally. We just came up the river by boat and we looked across on the south side, and that's about where the landing is. The river since 1867 is different location than it was. Before, of course, the river was on the other side, or the south side of the landing. The landing now, the physical place is on the south side, but it was washed away in a flood of 1867.
What is the picture you're holding?
Okay, the picture that I'm holding here is of a sketch of the landing area, the Cowlitz River flowing downstream. The steamboats came up, the immigrants came up to the landing at this location and started their overland journey. On this side of the landing we have Ed Warbass's donation land claim area, and on the other side is Clark's donation land claim. And the area of Warbass's became known as Warbass Port. And they both kind of melded together and became Cowlitz Landing, and then a few years later it became Toledo, a short distance upstream, which was the head of the steamboat navigation.
How did you determine the exact site here, Chuck?
All right, if you'd hold that for me. I have in my hand a GPS, which is Global Positioning Satellite device, and I programmed into it the coordinates for the Cowlitz Landing site, which I took from a USGS map. And then with that programmed into the GPS, we drove until it told us we were close to the site, and right here it reads the bearing from where we are to the actual landing site is 93 degrees, which is just a little bit south of east, and it's 288 feet away, which is across the river about where we can see the little blue house.
Earlier, we were shown this tree, which you'll see in a minute. It's a huge cedar tree, which can be seen from the river. And as you look up the tree, you'll see that many, many years ago, someone, and possibly Native Americans, as this was shown to us by a Native American, someone cut into this tree and did some smoking of something to get the smoke going up it. This is called the honey tree. And it's possibly 150 years ago this was done, and there are still bees. You probably can see them flying around above you. Undoubtedly, this old tree has been here as long as any of the pioneers and way before.